New doubts that Ukrainian President Zelensky will be invited to take part in the upcoming summit with President Trump and Vladimir Putin on Friday. Here's what the president said just a short time ago.
I'm going to meet with President Putin, and we're going to see what he has in mind. And if it's a fair deal, I'll reveal it to the European Union leaders and to the NATO leaders, and also to President Zelensky. I think out of respect, I'll call him first. And then I'll call them after. And I may say, lots of luck, keep fighting, or I may say we can make a deal.
Well, the decision to even invite Putin is controversial, and so is the location, Alaska, a former Russian territory. The setting being celebrated by Russian nationalists who have long believed it was a mistake for Moscow to have given up Alaska, much like how Putin rues the loss of Ukraine. NBC's Yamiche Alcindor covers the White House for us. Also with us, Mark Polymeropoulos, former CIA chief of operations in Europe and Eurasia and an MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst. Welcome both. Yamiche, what more did we hear from the president about this summit?
Well, the big question coming into the room was he going to have the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, at the table? We had heard from sources that he was considering and making the invitation to President Zelensky, but ultimately President Trump made it very clear that this is going to be a bilateral meeting between him and Vladimir Putin. He said, in fact, that after they meet, he will then maybe call the president of Ukraine and see if there can then be a trilateral meeting between him, President Zelensky, and President Putin. But it's really interesting because President Zelensky has said no sort of peace deal can be brokered without Ukraine at the table. The president also was very interesting today in really reiterating that he believes that there needs to be a swapping of territories. That was the language that President Trump used today. The big question is he essentially going to demand that Ukraine give up part of its territory? President Zelensky says that the Ukrainian constitution doesn't allow them to do that. But the president then said, well, you know what? President Zelensky needs to get around his own constitution because if a deal needs to be made, a deal needs to be made. The president also said he'll know within the first 2 minutes of sitting down with Vladimir Putin if a deal can be made. When he was asked, well, how would you know that? He said, well, I'm somebody who knows how to make deals, so I just know that it'll be essentially his gut telling him. So we're definitely going to be watching very closely what happens on Friday and then also what happens subsequently, because we'll know, it seems like, in pretty short order, whether or not there's a sort of movement toward peace or whether President Trump might throw up his hands and say continue fighting. Chris?
Well, Mark, let me play for you exactly what Donald Trump just said about Zelensky.
Volodymyr Zelensky is not invited on Friday?
He wasn't a part of it. I would say he could go, but he's gone to a lot of meetings. You know, he's been there for 3.5 years. Nothing happened.
I wonder what you make of a summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that excludes one party that would need to be needed to make peace.
Well, Chris, first of all, this is a summit that's based on the false notion that Russia is willing to make any deals. Remember, Steve Witkoff, the envoy, went to Moscow, and after that, total confusion reigned. He came back. There needed to be multiple clarifications. Somehow he reported that Putin may be willing to give up some territory. The Russians then came back, said they were not, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians became quite alarmed. And I think they're going to be more alarmed, frankly, after today, where Trump was seemingly blaming Zelensky for the war, which is preposterous. But also, it looks like he's just winging it. You know, he's going just to sit down to Putin to take his temperature. That's usually not the way summits go. So in some ways, you always want the Ukrainians to be responsible for their own negotiations. But, you know, if Zelensky was there right now for this initial meeting, I think the worry is that both Russia, both Putin and Trump are going to gang up on him. Because remember, Trump just wants a deal for this, you know, his grand prize, which is to get a Nobel. A bad peace is going to be much worse. That's what the Ukrainians are very worried about. I think after the press conference today, there's going to be much more alarm in Kyiv and in Europe.
Well, Trump's national security advisor, as I'm sure you've heard, Mark, John Bolton, he's among the experts who has been very critical of this summit. If people haven't heard it, let me play it.
I think Trump has made some mistakes already. Number one, in holding this meeting on American soil, legitimizing a pariah leader of a rogue state. But what Putin gets more than anything else is an opportunity one-on-one to try and get his magic working again with Trump, applying that KGB training, whether intentionally or unintentionally. He pushed Trump further than Trump wanted to be pushed, and you saw the reaction. What Putin wants to get back. He's not so worried about the sanctions. He wants the relationship back with Trump.
So you heard what the former national security advisor said, essentially two parts. One, it's obviously Putin, he believes, who's getting the better deal here. And watch to see what he does in terms of using his KGB training. Would you agree with what John Bolton is saying?
I absolutely agree with John Bolton saying, Putin is a very wily veteran intelligence officer. I think he has, a book on Trump in terms of a psychological profile. He's going to know how to manipulate him.
Well, can we also just say when was it? Days, weeks ago, suddenly we went from it was going to be more, sanctions against Russia to, oh, come on over, we'll have a meeting.
Right. So who's going to show up? Is it the Trump who is being a little bit tougher on Russia, allowing the U.S. to sell weapons to the European allies who then could pass them on to the Ukrainians? Or is it going to be the Trump of the first term who really detested Zelensky and the Ukrainians? Let's not forget the 2018 Helsinki summit, Chris. I think we all have post-traumatic stress from that when our own Jonathan Lemaire asked that famous question about Russian interference in 2016, and Trump sided with the Russians on this against the intelligence community. The great worry is that when Putin gets Trump in a room, he's going to use his, old intelligence training to flatter. And these are some things that Trump seems to like. And then you're going to have a press conference when the concern is that Trump kind of gives away the farm in terms of Ukraine. I don't see any national security professional, apolitical professional, who thinks this is going to turn out well on Friday in Alaska. I think there really is great concern.
Mark Polymeropoulos, Yamiche Alcindor, thank you both.